Vishy Anand is affectionately known as the Tiger from Madras, and he is eating these guys for breakfast right now in the Suprbet Rapid and Blitz Championship, which is taking place in Warsaw, Poland. So we've had 3 days of Rapid now. Today was day 3, and Vishy picked up where he left off in fine form. This is his game against David Gavrilescu from Romania, only 19 years old. He kicks off with the white pieces here and goes pawn to e4. So Vishy goes e5, we had knight to f3, and after knight c6, we don't go in for a Roy Lopez or an Italian, we have a Scotch game. Not so often seen, but a venomous opening in its own right. We now had captures on d4, the knight recaptured, and now bishop c5 is a very main move here. Anand goes for knight to f6 instead, the so-called Schmidt variation, and white can play knight c3 there. We go back into a 4-knight Scotch, but instead we had captures on c6, the pawn recaptured here, and now e5 is a very theoretical move. There's a whole bunch of theory that goes like this: knight d5, pawn c4, and then knight b6, bishop a6 are both very, very theoretical moves. But we didn't have any of this e5 stuff in this game. Instead, we had the quieter bishop to d3 here. And now Anand goes d5, he strikes at the centre, the principled move. Now if you kick on with e5 here, this is actually a mistake because knight g4 comes and this pawn's actually seriously under pressure and dropping off. If you try and defend with, say, pawn to f4 here, well then bishop c5 is a massive problem on these dark squares. So of course the players understand this. After pawn d5, we had the standard captures on d5, the pawn recaptures here, white castled the king, Vishy went bishop to e7, and now pawn c4 strikes at the centre here, but Vishy just castles the king, he leaves white to take on d5, his knight hops in, and we can see that white has the better pawn structure here, yes, with the two connected pawns, but in compensation, black's got good active pieces, a slight lead in development, and already black has equalised in this position really. There's not so much to show for white. This is kind of the reason why you don't see this so often at elite level chess, although this is rapid, so you can mix it up a bit. So the bishop now came to e4, it pressures the knight on d5, also x-rays the rook, so c6 dealt with both threats. And now you could play something like knight c3 here. You want to develop the knight into the game, but then of course black can take. We get this symmetrical pawn structure with weak pawns. The queens could come off. Vishy maybe wouldn't have done this, but it's a very, very equal position after, say, bishop to e6. If you take on c6, by the way, well, the rook can come to the c file and black will be winning the pawn back. So we didn't have the knight coming to c3. Instead, bishop d2 was played, prepares knight to c3, but now Anand goes rook to b8. His timing in this game was just impeccable, how he moves the pieces around here so masterfully. So he hits the pawn on b2. It was protected by the queen. That also now forms a battery with the bishop, hits the h7 pawn, but Vishy ignores that. He goes bishop to f6, so he's pressuring this one. And white doesn't have time to take here, although you pick up with check. After king h8, there's now two threats here. One is taking on b2, the other is going pawn g6, trapping the bishop. And white doesn't have time to deal with both of those threats. Black is actually better. So taking there is no good. Instead, we had the bishop coming to c3 here. Just to show you as well, if white went knight to c3 here, this is a mistake, because now you get knight to b4. You're not obliged to actually capture that knight on c3, of course. And the problem here is you hit the queen and the d3 square, say queen d1 for example, well then bishop a6, we hit the rook, we hit that d3 square, the knight is hopping in, and white will be forced to give up this bishop in a moment basically. It's just not such a good way to play. So that's why the knight didn't come to c3 here. Instead, the bishop came to c3, but now Vishy can pick up this bishop instead. So he took that one, the knight recaptured. Now there is a threat to take on h7 with check, so he goes g6. And now if white takes this pawn, the problem here is that bishop f5 comes. I mean, this is playable for white, but it's just not quite ideal, because now the queen would be kicked away, say to a4, you can take on b2. The computer says white's still okay with rook a to d1, an equal position here, but it's not exactly how you want to be playing as white, with the rook crashing through on your 7th. So that's why we didn't have this pawn taken on c6 immediately. Instead, white keeps the bishop there, stops bishop f5 for now. This one's perennially weak, so you can pick it up later in the game. There's no need to rush. And so rook a c1 was played instead, coming to that open file. And now again, Vishy's timing here is excellent. You know, he might want to develop that c8 bishop to f5 one day, picking up a tempo on the queen if this bishop was, say, on c6. So he doesn't develop this bishop to e6 yet. Instead, he goes queen a5, activating that heavy piece. And here Gavrilescu plays an inaccurate move. So he should continue here with taking that pawn now. Although Vishy could go bishop e6 or say bishop f5, it is his best move. The game goes on, it's roughly level. Black's slightly for choice with the bishop pair, but there's not too much in it. But instead of taking that pawn on c6, instead we had a very ambitious move of knight to a4. So in a dream scenario, you'll get pawn b3 in, you'll land the knight on c5, then white's doing quite well. But the problem is the move that Vishy played in response, which is pawn c5 here. It's just an excellent positional move, and you start to make this knight on the rim look really silly. So what's the big idea here? Well, if you take with the knight, then we can crash through on b2 with the rook. You've obviously left the defense now. This is the problem. Good position for black. And if you take with the queen, well, now you've left the defense of your knight. So black simply takes your knight here. So you can't actually capture that c5 pawn. It's immune. That's the big problem. And here white makes it even worse. The best move was to actually come back with the bishop to d3, but we had pawn b3 instead, holding the knight, now looking to pick up this pawn. But can you find Vishy's response? Excellent move, tactical prowess at its finest. And if you're enjoying this game, do let me know by hitting that like button. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, do consider to never miss a future video. So here in this position, Vishy went pawn c4. And again, that pawn is immune. So if you capture with the queen, well, that's the simplest to refute. We've got bishop to a6, skewering queen to rook, picking up an exchange. And if you take with the pawn here, well, now you've got massive problems after rook to b4. And we see similar themes to this in the game. That knight is actually trapped. It's got no hops to come back. We can see the bishop covers. If it comes to c3, by the way, well, then we pick up on c4. Again, you've got massive problems. And long story short, that knight will actually be dropping off the board soon. You'd be forced to do something like bishop to c6 to hold it, but then bishop f5, you kick the queen from the defense. If queen d1, rook d8, the line goes on here, but white's really bad, completely busted. This will be dropping off soon enough. So that's why you can't actually take that pawn with the pawn on b3. Rook b4 is just too much of an issue. And here we had rook fd1 instead. Best would have been knight b2, by the way, trying to recycle it back into the game. But by this point, Gavrilescu was really struggling, getting down on the clock. He's struggling to see his way through the tactics. So after rook f to d1, Vishy now brought his bishop out to e6. He finally develops that piece. Rook b1 was played, looking to deal with that b-file pressure, the rook invasion. But now rook f to c8, the final piece of Vishy's, joins the attack. They're all playing here. b4 was tried desperately to keep that c-file closed, but this just gives a pawn, of course. So that one was snapped off. The rook recaptured, queen takes, and once again that knight is just completely dominated. It's got no squares. So pawn g3 was played. Now this pawn came to c3. Still the knight can't go anywhere. Bishop d5 was played. So finally the bishop pair is traded off. The rook recaptures. But after rook c4, here Gavrilescu actually resigned. The knight's dropping off. It's completely busted. Just a beautiful positional crush from Vishy in, what was it, 25 moves? Phenomenal stuff. And he went on to actually win this rapid part of the tournament. So he drew against Fabi in the next game, and that meant that he actually won this rapid part of the overall tournament with a round to spare. because Richard Rapport was the chaser. They did actually play in round 9. Now Rapport beat Anand in round 9, but despite that loss, Anand still finished top. They now go into 2 days of blitz chess. Great stuff by Vishy Anand. Congratulations to him on winning this rapid part of the event. If you enjoyed this video, then do subscribe to the channel to never miss another and see all of Anand's other amazing games from this tournament. Click here. Thanks for watching. See you soon.